Sri Lanka is going through an unprecedented crisis at the moment. It's largely economic, but there is a political dimension as well. But as we speak, we are facing 13-hour power cuts. This is in the recent history, this is the longest we've had power cuts for. In terms of even during the war, we didn't have such long power cuts. So that just speaks to the crisis at the present moment. And as we speak, we may lose power. One never knows. It's that uncertain these days. But the power cuts is just one dimension. We have shortages of essential items such as medicine, food, gas, fuel, and it's created a situation where there's uncertainty among many as to what holds the next day, even today and the next day. So it's very much short term things that people are very worried about, very limited thinking in terms of the long term implications. And if you travel around Sri Lanka, it's not just in urban settings, even in rural settings, you see long queues. So far, we've had 5 deaths of people who just stood in line to get fuel. And that's a very, very worrying situation because that has also called out the military to the fuel station. So there is a militarization dimension which we can go into. But largely, it's a situation of complete chaos and a crisis. This is not a new thing, but I would say in the last few years, it has been exacerbated by complete lack of planning, policy incoherence, tax cuts. It's a combination. But the fact that this has been in the making for under successive governments in Sri Lanka needs to be recognized. We have a bloated state structure, so that needs to be addressed, and it hasn't been addressed for so long. But this government, the government of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was elected in November 2019. And very soon after, there were large tax cuts brought in by this government, which reduce government revenue. So that's one of the biggest issues at the moment is the government doesn't have sufficient revenue, and the foreign currency issue or the depletion of foreign currency is one of the major challenges at the present moment. So I think in January, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka said we have only 2.3 billion foreign reserves. And we had 7.5 foreign currency reserves in 2019. So there's a huge depletion in the last few years. The government said, look, the pandemic was one of the reasons, and they were not prepared and couldn't foresee some of the setbacks brought in by the pandemic. But it's not just one dimension or one aspect that has resulted in this. In the last 2.5 years under this government, there's been complete chaos in terms of policy incoherence. There's been U-turns of several key policies. One is the fertilizer ban, which has impacted food security and livelihoods. So there's multiple issues and goes back several years, but more recently, it's the lack of planning, preparations, and really not having sufficient policies in place, especially when one was aware these challenges were were coming to Sri Lanka. So it can be blamed on successive governments and lack of planning preparations, but I would say there is a huge responsibility on this government when there were indicators and warnings from different stakeholders that we were going to come to this and not having sufficient plans in place. I think there are different actors who need to play a role here. The opposition is one. I would go back to the whole point of the role of the parliament. So in terms of the present moment, we have a very strong executive and an executive that has become stronger in the last few years because of constitutional amendments that were brought in 2020. But there still remains a role for Parliament, and that's very, very critical. And I think that's something we all need to be mindful of Sri Lanka is a democracy and there are different actors that have a role. And next week, we have a very important debate in Parliament on the IMF bailout the government is proposing, and that we can speak to a bit. But I would go back to the fact that we have a very, very strong executive, and the responsibility really lies with the government, the president, the prime minister, the cabinet. And one really needs to go back to promises made in 2019 and 2020 during the election cycle, when this government came up with this the framework of vistas of prosperity and splendor, which said there'll be stability, economic growth, security, and a whole host of promises. Fast forward that to 2022, we are yet to see any of this. So, question is, why did the government not have things in place despite the pandemic, when there's warnings in advance that we were heading towards crisis in Sri Lanka? But as you said, there's also a role for different actors. The opposition has a key role. In recent weeks, we have seen different parties in the opposition having large protests, making strong statements. There was a collective effort by some of the opposition members of parliament to write to the government, which was a good move that they collectively came together in terms of the economic crisis. But we have also, unfortunately, not seen real leadership as a collective from the opposition, and insisting there be a dialogue. So last week, the president had an all-party conference. The main opposition group did not attend this, so there's only a few who attended this. So there's a lot of divisions within the opposition as well, and it is unfortunate at this crisis moment the opposition also can't come together. But this whole issue of the military also, I just want to flag here, is Sri Lanka has seen decades where the military has become stronger. During the war, they had a particular role. Post-war, and Sri Lanka has been in the post-war setting since 2009, the military has expanded their role to civilian function, and this is a very, very worrying aspect as well. Now, with the pandemic, and this is in 2020, 2021, and ongoing, the military in Sri Lanka is playing a role in terms of addressing the pandemic with vaccine rollout, the surveillance, the quarantine centers earlier. So the military carved out a particular role during the pandemic, and I would say legitimized their role in a post-war setting. Now what we see is the military being called out to man fuel stations or to provide security, but the worry is what else would it lead to? This is in a context where former military officials as well as serving military officials are playing critical roles in governance and government. So that dimension also needs to be kept in mind when we talk about um, the role and responsibility of government, the role and responsibility of the opposition. There is a very powerful actor in terms of the military also that needs to be factored in. China is one actor, but the largest debt Sri Lanka holds is with sovereign bonds. And that's one of the biggest worries at the moment, because the debt repayment at this moment in July, there's a 1 billion debt repayment due, and there's 7 billion due later in the year as well. So that's there are multiple actors in terms of Sri Lanka's debt that needs to be recognized. But China does have a huge role in Sri Lanka, and not just with the debt, but also geopolitics, and also its role in the international fora as well. For example, Sri Lanka is before the UN Human Rights Council, and China has always been a friend in terms of protecting Sri Lanka's interests in these settings. So there's different dimensions with China's role and the economic dimension. But I would say with all this debt, and the debt has grown, one of the biggest questions that need to be asked is Sri Lanka keeps borrowing and borrowing against more and more loans. Is how is this repayment going to work? Um, and for many of us, we've been calling for the need for debt restructuring in terms of really having a serious conversations as to how that debt can be repaid, but also not just the repayment, but how does it get balanced with the needs of Sri Lankans? Because many economists will say, look, you can pay the debt, but how does that impact the lives of Sri Lankans? And that's what we've been seeing in the last few weeks, is that by paying a particular a payment due in January, that money could have been, if restructured, could have been used to pay for much needed things like fuel and medicine and other things. So, in July, we're going to have the same conversation as to if one is to pay that 1 billion, how does that impact the people in Sri Lanka? So there are very complex questions. We don't want to get into a default situation, but it's also asking the questions as to how it has an impact in daily lives, in the lives of people of Sri Lanka. So major questions. But unfortunately, what we've seen, and this is a very important thing, is the government keeps going to the international actors asking for money. But there's very limited information in Sri Lanka as to what potential terms and conditions come with these borrowings, with these loans, with these credit lines. So I think this is something to really raise, is that with China or IMF or anyone else, and there's a whole host of them, is what are the terms? How is that going to play in Sri Lanka in the short term as well as in the long term? And that information is not available. The IMF, I mean, there's no guarantee we're going to get an IMF bail. They're just starting the conversation. I think that's also something to keep in mind. This is not going to be guaranteed. It's not going to be the panacea that's going to address all the problems in Sri Lanka. We are all very, cautiously watching what's playing out, because the finance minister of Sri Lanka is going to meet with the IMF, I believe, in early April. And this is a very, very initial stage. For so long, the government said they did not want to go to the IMF. So that also speaks to a very particular problem in this government, is they just do not seem to have a plan to address the complex challenges at the moment. They seem to be playing politics, and very populist politics, in that there's a constituency that opposes any form of international intervention. There is a constituency that's suspicious of all these international dimensions. And unfortunately, in the absence of information coming from the government, we've come to the conclusion that these are knee-jerk reactions as well. So an IMF, commencing a dialogue with the IMF is no guarantee we're going to get the assistance that's required. Even if assistance or the bailout package comes, one will really need to look at what terms and what conditions are there. IMF bailouts come with very strict regulations and could have serious implications also for the country. So we'll have to study what happens. But we're very early days in terms of even that dialogue. And I don't think there's any guarantee that's going to address the problems at the present moment. The role of India, I would say, is very important to watch. This week, we had the Indian Foreign Secretary in Sri Lanka. He had meetings with key government actors, the president, the prime minister, and others, as well as opposition. And this is in the wake of a credit line opening when our finance minister was in Delhi a few weeks ago. And there seems to be further requests for financial assistance. Now, India has had a role in Sri Lanka for many decades, and India is a country that Sri Lankans have looked to in terms of different issues, from the economic issue at the present moment to the political issues. India was very involved in the introduction of the 13th Amendment, the devolution of power, and has been involved in addressing the ethnic question, the Tamil issues faced by the Tamil community. So, India has a particular role in Sri Lanka, always has, and will continue to have. Now, how China's role, an increasing role in Sri Lanka, is to be seen is something we will have to closely monitor. China, as we've discussed before, is playing a role in terms of the economic dimension, but there's also large debt. There's also a lot of projects funded by Chinese funds that raises a lot of questions in terms of, are these feasible projects? We have the Hambantota Port project, we have the Port City project in Colombo, and just to be upfront, we were in court challenging the Port City project last year, just around a year ago, raising questions of sovereignty and really the effectiveness of such projects. Now, a year after, there are still questions as to, has has that kind of project really provided the economic incentives that it was projected to provide last year? So there are questions in terms of China's role in Sri Lanka. Does it bring in the economic incentives and dimensions that seems to be projected by different actors, and that's yet to be proven? So these are complex questions, but there's also, I think, in the present moment, lots of questions as to what is the role of the different actors, but how does that relate to the interests of Sri Lankans? And that is something I think we need to keep raising. One of the things I just want to leave with the audience is we are in crisis mode. We are seeing chaos in terms of governance and government. We're seeing an increasing role with the military. And Sri Lanka's history in terms of the calling out of the troops, bringing in emergency, raises questions as to what is the government going to do when the crisis is likely to increase. I mean, we're talking about more than half a day of power cuts. Every day there's a protest. People are getting to the streets. So, to manage all of this, what is likely to be the government response? And I have a very sinking feeling there might be brute force use, there might be violence use, and these security laws provide certain powers. But in and maybe one possible positive note is we still have functioning institutions. We have a critical role for the parliament, and I think it's very important that we look to these democratic processes, democratic institutions, despite the chaos, despite the uncertainties, because we really do not want to go back to cycles of violence we've seen in Sri Lanka before. We have gone through so much. And it's very important to keep in mind that Sri Lanka is a democracy, a functioning democracy.